Chata saya, Gabrielino Tongba Ola Kodiagnimako, Apisahan Ship B Kanatoka, Hachimanolili, Chihuama, Lokotliapa Iloayashaka, Ishpoholito Blachki, Michananakat, Chokmat Chika, Ishpo Pisahan Chachki, Yamikma, Ilimomakat, Iloiti Bachafachi, Yamamashki. Hi everyone. I greeted you in the Chickasaw language and welcomed you to our program on behalf of the American Indian Studies Center and the Department of World Arts and Culture. Thank you for joining us today. I gave you my Chickasaw name, which is Ihoitana, and I shared that I am Chickasaw and Choctaw by descent. I'm a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation. I acknowledge the Gabrielino Tonga peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovanga, which is the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands. As a land grant institution, we pay our respects to the Honukritam ancestors, Ahihiram elders, and Iohinkem, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. And by the way, those are Tonga words, not Chickasaw there at the end, in case I'm confusing you with too many languages. Finally, I ask the Creator to look over all of us who are in our community here today, that we may be well, and that we may be together as one. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Tria Wakpa from the Department of World Arts and Cultures, who will introduce our guests today. Welcome.
Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Tria, and I wanted to begin by thanking Pamela so much, Pamela Peters, for all of her hard work organizing this event today. I'm really happy to be a part of it and looking forward to today's talk. So I just wanted to give you a brief overview. I'll be reading Gerald Clarke's bio to introduce him. And then Pamela asked for me to pose a few questions to Gerald following the talk. And then after I ask questions, we will open it up for other people's questions that you may have. And the way that the Zoom is set up, you won't be able to ask those questions orally, but you can type them in the chat and we will pose them for you. So to introduce Gerald, Gerald Clarke is an enrolled member of the Cahuilla Band of Indians and lives on the Cahuilla Indian Reservation. When not creating artwork or serving as an assistant professor of ethnic studies at the University of California, Riverside, Gerald oversees the Clarke family cattle ranch and remains heavily involved in Cahuilla culture. He is a frequent lecturer speaking about Native art, culture, and issues. He serves on the Cahuilla Tribal Council and works on issues affecting the tribe. When not working, Clarke participates in bird singing, a traditional form of singing that tells the cosmology of the Cahuilla people. Welcome, Gerald.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Did you notice in that introduction, it didn't say anything about my spare time. I have no spare time. It seems like I've got a lot of irons in the fire, and you're going to see some of those irons today. So to get started, I'm going to share my screen with you. And Pamela or Tria, just let me know that you can see my screen.
We can see your screen.
Okay, great. So, before I start, I want to thank, the organizers and, all of you. It's a humbling experience, when people take time out of their lives to spend some time with me and hearing about some of the things I'm up to and what I'm, the artworks and some of my ideas. And so I really appreciate all of you being here. I think it's an amazing thing, actually. So yeah, my name is Gerald Clarke. I'm an enrolled member of the Cahuilla Band of Indians. I'm currently serving on Tribal Council. And the title of today's talk is Embracing Creative Sovereignty. And the image that you see there is a nice little introduction to my work. This is a work that's actually, it's in process. It's not finished, but I've carved the word sovereignty right into the end of a Louisville Slugger bat. And so I preserved the Louisville Slugger so everyone knows what it is. And this will be my Sovereignty War Club when it gets done. And I plan on doing a whole series of them with different words or concepts. But anytime I talk about my work as an artist, I always start with where I'm from, right? Because the environment, the land where I'm from, it colors how I see the world. And this picture I took off of my aunt every evening. I have to say I'm kind of enjoying a little bit of the pandemic because it's slowed everything down. And so every evening I go over to my aunt's house, and she's 85 years old, and we sit on her back porch and we watch the cows graze, and she tells me stories and things. And so this is this is how I see the world. This is my backyard, basically. And it's very important to me, and it's part of my identity. And it's part of our tribe's history. I used to teach in Oklahoma, so I know, I've been around tribes who are actually 1,000 miles or more from their traditional homelands. And I really feel for them, because we're lucky enough to have a small sliver of our traditional homelands being Cahuilla. And so, this is an image of some bedrock mortars that aren't far from the reservation, but California is littered with these types of bedrock mortars. And I imagine some of you have seen, you can see these indentions into the rock here. And this is where, my ancestors would have ground acorns, one of our traditional staples that is still being eaten today and prepared today. And I take, my daughters out and we go and gather acorn. And, I should say I have both an MA, I have a BA, an MA, and an MFA in art. And I've taken a lot of sculpture classes, and I've carved marble and limestone, alabaster. And I took a chisel to one of these rocks just to see, right? And for lack of a better way of saying it, it's hard as a rock, these granite boulders. And to see these mortar holes here, some of them are like 10, 12 inches deep. They're really amazing. And you're talking, lifetimes. You're talking generations of our people who have been grinding on these bedrock mortars to create, to make their food and ultimately to create these mortar holes. And so one of the things I want to stress here is, that my view of history is not simply a chapter in a book. Okay, it's not a documentary on PBS. I see history, and I think we've really failed in the American educational system of boiling history down to names, dates, and quote unquote facts, right? And real human lives, real human experiences. And so when I see this around in my environment, when I see this evidence of our existence here on these lands for thousands and thousands of years and generations of Cahuilla people, I know where I'm at in the world, right? And so I understand that history isn't simply a chapter in a book. It's lived human experience. And so this slide, that's my hand up there at the top. And, I know places around here, old village sites, where there's just like pottery shards and things just lying on the ground, right? That's it's evidence of our history and how long we've been here. So the mortar stones, the land itself, the material culture that we made, whether it was pottery or it's baskets. So I'm calling this like sovereign history. This is real. I feel a real connection to the history of my people through the land, through our stories, including our songs, and then through various objects. And so I see myself as an artist, I'm part of that continuation, right? A continuum of Cahuilla human experience, and I make things and I leave evidence behind. Once I'm gone, things will exist, right? And so this is, I believe, what I call sovereign history. Okay, so when I introduce myself and I do an artist lecture, I like to be really honest, and I want to inform you that I am not full-blooded Cahuilla, okay? In fact, my dad wasn't full-blooded Cahuilla. My grandparents met at the Sherman Indian School down there in Riverside. My grandma was a Cahuilla Indian from here in Southern California, and I'm here on the Cahuilla Indian Reservation talking to you right now. But my grandfather was Wallapai from the Wallapai Reservation up near Peach Springs, Arizona. We have relatives up there. We also have some relatives up at Hoopa in Northern California. So I try to be really honest on who I am. And actually the Clarke name comes through my grandpa's side on the Wallapai Reservation. And so somewhere way back there was a German immigrant who had married into the tribe. And so according to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, I am 3/8 degree, I have 3/8 degree Indian blood. And you know, when you meet non-natives and they find out, you know, that you're native and you're enrolled and all that, and they think it's pretty neat. And then when they find out you're not full-blooded, and in my case, not even half, I'm considered 3/8, right? And so they're just like, huh, and there's just like this letdown. So you go through life meeting people and they find this out and it's, oh, you know, it's always like you're a living disappointment to them, you know? And I guess that kind of thing wouldn't bother me so bad if I only experienced 3/8 of the poverty that I experienced growing up. If I only experienced 3/8 of the domestic violence or alcoholism, right, that growing up, or that only 3/8 of my family had passed away from complications due to diabetes, you see? So it doesn't work that way. And so this artwork, the problem with color theory, I have 3 self-portraits out of plaster, about 18 inches tall. And so the red image there on your left is symbolic of my dad's line. And the white image on the right is symbolic of my mom's line, because her family were white people from Oklahoma who came to Southern California during the Dust Bowl era. And so, you know, those represent, you know, I'm a mixed race person. Those represent 2 sides of my race. And those of you who've had any kind of art classes, you take equal amounts of red and white and you get pink, right? Well, I'm not pink, right? There I am in the middle. And so I'm really talking about the problem of color theory, how we've dumbed down race into simply a color of red, white, black, yellow, green, etc., right? And it doesn't encompass humanity. Humanity is not easily quantifiable or can be categorized so easily. And so, you know, I'm conscious of that, and I'm open with people. I'm not trying to be anyone's Indian. I am who I am. I found this image on the internet. I thought it was really funny, but you know, when you're a boy and you are growing up here in America, what do? Well, one of the things you do is you play cowboys and Indians. I don't know if they do that today, but they did back when I was the kid. And I have to tell you that I was a little confused. You know, these categories of the cowboy or the Indian, right? They're like opposites, right? Like you can't have them together. Just like today, we can't seem to have conservatives and liberals come together, or Democrats and Republicans, right? But I gotta tell you that I learned very early on that this kind of trying to quantify humanity, right? To categorize humanity is a completely false endeavor. Because I was raised as an Indian cowboy, right? I was both, right? I didn't know which side to go to. And so here's some pictures. The picture there on the left, that's my dad and my grandpa from the 70s. And you can see they've got their pistols and their boots on and their cowboy hats. And then there's the center picture. That's a picture of my dad just a couple years before he passed away. And listen, these guys were hardcore Indian cowboys. They worked hard, they played hard, and this is part of who we were growing up. And so there's me there on the right. I can't help but laugh when I see that, but I was raised to kind of be that way. You know, I wasn't raised to be an artist, but from an early age, I understood this was part of who we are. This is part of our identity, and what the expectation was of me. And so here's a couple images of our cattle herd. I can tell the upper picture is a little bit older because we only have one red cow. Most of all of them are black now, like the picture you see below with the new calf there. And I really like ranch work. I like hard work, And you know, the mainstream art world, they're trying to sell this image of the artist as almost like philosopher or social critic, right? But you can sit around and think about things and have all kinds of ideas, but until you make something, that's all you are, is a social critic and a philosopher. And I really appreciate the physical labor it takes to create art. We don't talk about the physicality of art production, but it's really what draws me it's what initially drew me to making art, because you know, I find it's pretty therapeutic to work with my hands, and I don't really differentiate much between making a sculpture or mending fence or, you know, working on the corral. I think actually it's a really nice partnership, and I love being out in the environment, right? And running cattle, while it may not be seen as being traditional indigenous practice, it encourages me to pay attention to the wind, to pay attention to rainfall, to pay attention to the growing of the grass. And I think in that way, very much like our traditional ecological knowledge, it's very similar, actually. And just to be honest, we do butcher. We butchered a steer about a month ago, and my sister and my freezer is now full, and we have some food sovereignty. There we go. The use of sovereignty again. But this is part of what we do. When my dad passed away, we butchered a steer because we're expected to feed the people. So cattle ranching has become part of our culture and tradition. And so this is an image. We have our annual Clarke family roundup here at my house, usually end of May, 1st of June. To be honest with you, this year is the first year we haven't done the roundup because of the pandemic, and it felt very strange not to do that, because it's kind of what we do every year. And that's me there with the cowboy hat in the middle, and we have Indian cowboys from all the local reservations converge on my house. We cook a bunch of meat down in the ground overnight in the pit, and so we work hard, then we have a big lunch. And so you see, I put their sovereign identity. I'm not willing to turn my identity over to anybody else, nor am I willing to allow outsiders, non-natives, to determine what kind of Indian I am. I would take that even farther and to say that, you know, I'm not a Native American artist, I'm a Cahuilla artist. And that's very specific, but it's how I identify these days. And, you know, I'm not even willing to have another Native person tell me what kind of Native artist I should be. And so you're taking control of my identity, I think, is really important, and it influences the type of work that I do, and really how I see the world. Here's a quote from a good friend of mine. Gordon Johnson's a writer from the Paula Reservation, and he says, "I can't speak for everyone, but," and let me say, I love the fact, you know, he starts with this, you know, his humility is just really outstanding, I think, and I think it's such an indigenous way to start a statement. But he says, "I can't speak for everyone, but I think Native art is an expression of cultural sovereignty." So he's using the word, the description, cultural sovereignty, which in the biggest picture is the ability of Native people to determine who they are. And I, you know, I totally agree with that. And so he's calling it cultural sovereignty. I'm calling it, you know, the sovereignty of identity, right? All right, so let's talk a little bit. Let me show you some more art, you know. And so back in 2002, you know, one of the things I've found is that the artwork that I think is most successful when I create something is when it comes from my personal experience. And so the upper image there, you see the title is "To the Distinguishing Collector." And what I did was I just decided I'm going to make a branding iron sculpture. And so I made this branding iron sculpture with the word Indian on it. And I made it as a sculpture, and I showed it as a sculpture for a couple years, several years actually. And then later on, and I guess this shows you how dense my thinking is, it was years later that I was like, you know, I should brand something with that sculpture. And so I got some watercolor paper, soaked it, and then I branded this piece of paper to make this print. So the title, "To the Distinguishing Collector," what I was thinking about was, you know, there's a lot of non-native collectors, curators, historians who think it's appropriate for them to determine what Native American art is, or what authentic Native American art is, which is just absurd to me. So in a kind of a satirical reaction to people like that, I just said, okay, well, here's a branding iron. You can heat this up and you can brand artists and you can brand artworks that you deem to be authentic. It's kind of offensive, right? And so heating that up and branding the word into the paper, these branding prints they're kind of violent, actually. And I got to say, I'm not a violent person at all, but our history has an element of violence to it. And so I think that branding, the scarring of the paper, the charring of the paper, I think that helps convey, this kind of tumultuous, violent history that has been imposed on our peoples. And so that bottom image, you can see, that's the second. So I put that whole branding iron thing aside for a decade, and I found myself at an artist residency in Vermont. And whatever I was going to make, I was going to have to ship back home. And so I was trying to figure out how to do that. And so I decided to return to the branding irons series here. And so I made this branding iron that says native. And of course you got to do it backwards. Then when you brand it, it reads right? And so there's a print I did at the top, and you can see some areas, every one of these prints are different. Sometimes I get the branding iron too hot and the paper burns up. Sometimes it's too cold, it doesn't really print well. And so you can see the element of charring around the different letters or whatever is different. So what I do is I make a whole bunch of these and I hang them up in my studio like on a clothesline. Then I choose the ones that I like the best visually, but also the meaning behind them, what it's conveying. And those are the ones that I actually frame and show. So here's a couple more. So this image there on the left, the multiple native image, that's about 24 by 36 in size. And you can see that the top word native, you can see it was so hot it burned all the way through the paper. And so I brand that for say 10 seconds, then I'd go down 10 seconds, go down 10 seconds. So you can see that the branding iron, you can see how it's kind of slowly cooling down as it goes down the paper, but the word is also slowly fading too. So I'm thinking about this idea of how our history is being buried, erased, right? How our history seems to be, American history connected to what we're seeing now with the Confederate statues, right? Or even 9/11, never forget, right, is the message we're told. But then when it comes to indigenous history here in the United States, well, that's old, dead stuff. We don't want to do with it, right? So that's kind of what I'm thinking about when I'm doing these kinds of prints. And then while I was at Vermont, another artist at the colony picked up this used book that it was being taken out of circulation at a local library. And the title of the book was Disinherited, The Lost Birthright of the American Indian, by a non-native author, right? Most books about Indians are by non-native authors. And so she handed it to me. She said, oh, I thought you might find this interesting. And I said, I do. And I immediately just set it down and just branded the word native right across it. And so in doing so, that it was kind of by chance, but at the same time, it opened up a whole new avenue for me of using these branding irons. And, I'm reclaiming some of this information, right? And I'm making it indigenous, I'm making it native. And so I took someone's book that was being thrown away, right? Decommissioned out of the library, and I branded it. And then I actually opened up the book and I signed and dated the title page. So now it's my artwork, right? It's become an indigenous artwork, a native artwork. And so these are some of the things that I'm working on and that I've been creating lately. Here's another branded book there on the left. This is J.J. Brody's book, Indian Painters and White Patrons. And this was published in the 70s. And, just the title printed on the cover kind of hints at this kind of power struggle, right, that happens within the Indian art market. And, you know, you have to wonder how much the market is actually controlling what is being produced for the market by Native artists. And the market, right? It's a lot about commerce and the commodification of Native American art. I resist that. And so I haven't participated in any of the big Native art market there in Santa Fe because I don't like that dynamic, right? And then the image on paper there to the right, that's my hand. I scanned my hand in, traced it out onto a piece of steel. So some of the branding irons are words and some of them are, of images. Oh, let me go back real quick. I think you can see out from the edges of the brand, that's all caused from the extreme heat. And so I love that kind of, there's a performance art element of it too when I'm making these images. But going back to the book here, again, most books about Native American culture and Native American art, they're not written by natives, right? And so who's controlling the narrative? This is something that I'm always thinking about, even in working with museums and curatorial staff, who's controlling the narrative, right? I think it's really important that the artist has input on that. And that's part of that sovereignty that I keep thinking about and going back to. So here's an early work from the early 2000s. This is entitled Indian Wisdom, and it's from my monument series. And the monument series was simply, I was taking pre-made Greek columns and I was configuring them into these kind of like faux monuments or faux trophies. And so I got this Greek column and I altered it slightly. And then I bought a used gumball machine and mounted it on top. And then I took a ceramic version of James Earl Frazier's End of the Trail and I mounted it on top. A couple things I want to point out here is that's my picture in the glass on the front of the gumball machine. And, I have a good, wicked sense of humor. And just seeing my picture on the front of this where it says Indian Wisdom 25 cents, I think is hilarious, okay? But actually this thing functions. So I like the idea, people are afraid of contemporary art. And so by bringing in a gumball machine into the art museum, we all see those when we're walking out of the grocery store or the drugstore. It's something that's very common. And so that's my way of I use these, what we call found objects, to bring the viewer closer to come and interact with the work. So this sculpture, you can actually put a quarter in and crank it, and you get one of those plastic capsules. And inside the plastic capsule, what I do is every time I show this, I take a few books about Indian culture written by Indian authors and scholars. And to be honest with you, I destroy the books. I cut the pages out and I take one page and typically the pages have the author's name at the top and also the title of the book at the top. And I fold them up and I put them in those capsules. So you really are, when you put a quarter in this, you are buying some Indian wisdom. And it's my hope that the viewer will read that page, then go investigate that book and investigate that author. And I'm introducing them to this knowledge base from the community, from Native authors and scholars that they can then start to take in. And that James Earl Frazier End of the Trail at the top, if you're familiar with that image, that was this document that the Indian has succumbed to genocide. And we know that's false. I myself am evidence of the failed American genocide on the American Indian and on the Cahuilla people. So I want to point out, it may be hard for you to see, but I broke the spear of his original image from that ceramic piece and I replaced it with a pencil. And so for me, that's the image of the artist. That's the image of the writer resisting, fighting back, saying, no, you're wrong. We are still here. It was a failed genocide. So I'm trying to take that narrative back and alter it to be something that's a little more closer to what the tribes, what the communities, what the nations actually feel and think and believe. Okay, so a related, I know I'm going fast, but I got a lot of stuff for you, but a related series also are my stamped prints. So obviously, right, this is a self-portrait that I created. And actually, I created it with a rubber stamp. And everything that you see there is actually words. So I have this rubber stamp, and I can add little rubber letters to make words and different things. I stamp it on the ink pad, then I stamp it on the paper. And the more ink on the stamp, the darker it is, the less ink, the lighter it is. So you have this value scale, so you can make basically black and white gray images that look fairly decent, right? So what are the words? Well, here's a detail, and I don't know if you can really see it that well or not, but what I did was I took the names of the 6 most prescribed depression medications in America, and I created the entire image from those 6 medications, the names of those medications. So why am I doing that, right? Well, I gotta tell you, if I focused on all the things that my community has lost over the last few hundred years, you know, the way our people were treated. You know, my dad, I never heard my dad speak the Cahuilla language, but according to my aunt, he was fluent until he went to school and had it beat out of him. And it's tragic, right? And I think if I just focused on the things that we've lost, I think I would fall into a depression. And I've battled some depression, to be quite honest with you, on and off in my life. And so I'm trying to be really honest here. And I don't think I'm alone. And I think that by doing this, right, I'm validating and I'm acknowledging the pain of our tribal histories. And it needs to be understood. It needs to be known. We talk about intergenerational trauma or historic trauma, right? But again, it's not just a chapter in a book. These are lived and felt human experiences, and that's what I'm trying to put into the artwork. Now, that being said, I don't focus on just the negatives, right? I focus on the miracle that I'm here in front of you. I focus on the miracle that our language is being reclaimed as we speak. I'm focused on the miracle that we're still singing some of our songs. Maybe not all of them, but we're still singing our songs, right? We are the ultimate success story. Native Americans are the ultimate success story in America, and that's how we need to be teaching it in history classes, you know, elementary and high school and college. Okay, so, you know, I think a lot about my role as an artist. And, you know, the Western art tradition coming from Europe, brought over here to the United States, you know, this idea of self-expression, self-exploration, things like that. I see today a lot of activist art, and I equate that to kind of like the magnifying glass. I see a lot of Native American artists whose work focuses on a lot of the tragic history, but also this kind of criticizing, right, of white culture or American culture, of the current administration. You know, you can go on and on about all this stuff. Oil companies, yes. I gotta say, that's the easy road to take. It's so easy to just sit back and take pot shots at various things, right? And I think one of the things that I see lacking in the art world and in the Native art world is the idea of the mirror. So like that last self-portrait, I think it's also important to do some self-examination and examine your own culture and your own histories, right? And how we as Native people have reacted to all these things. And, you know, you can't just focus on the positive things. You've got to acknowledge all of it. And one of the things I tell my students in my classes is none of you and none of us are as good looking as our social media picture, right? We're always, you know, so perfect and so nice, right? But really, right, to have a true appreciation of one's culture, you have to take in all of it, the good and the bad. And so I think we need more of a mirror for artists. And I think that doing that, it shows, and I think one of the key things that sets me apart from mainstream artists, non-Native artists, is I feel a huge sense of responsibility. When my aunt's telling me those stories, you know, and I hear about the hardships she went through growing up, man, who am I to just waste her time expressing myself, right? And so I feel this huge sense of responsibility to the community, not to the art world, right? Not to other artists, but to my community. This responsibility, I think, is really important. I think that's a key aspect of Native American contemporary art, is this idea of make sure you know who your community is, and make sure, like, I don't think there are a lot of artists in the world that are making art for the people of the Cahuilla Indian Reservation, okay? Sure, people make beadwork and we make baskets and we do all these things, but particularly in the contemporary art realm, you know, it seems like there's, you know, I'm going to make something, I'm going to show it at the Whitney in New York City, or I'm going to have another show in London or what have you. But what about the people at home? Who's making artwork for the other people at home? And I feel a very strong responsibility towards them. And so for me, the role of an artist, and this is, and I'm not going to say all artists have to believe this. This is what works for me. Okay, is you have to have your cultural knowledge. Then you have to do some self-examination of yourself and your community. You combine that with your responsibility, this feeling of responsibility to that community, and that's what I call creative sovereignty. Now, I've heard people use the word cultural sovereignty or visual sovereignty. For me, creative sovereignty comes before all that. Creative sovereignty for me as an artist, that starts way before I ever pick up a pencil or a paintbrush or a chisel. This starts when the way I see the world and the way I think, right? And the ideas that I get, it all comes from this cultural knowledge, the self-examination, and this sense of responsibility. So that sense of responsibility in the early 2000s, I was like, you know, if I'm going to call myself a Cahuilla artist, seems like I should be doing stuff for the people, you know? And so I did a series of road signs that feature our native language, and I installed them along the dirt roads here on the reservation. And, you know, it didn't put the responsibility on the natives to drive to the museum. If any art people wanted to see it, they had to come to our community, right? And so I got words and sentences from a Cahuilla language textbook, and I put them in the form of these road signs. And I chose road signs because, you know, all of you, when you go and you're traveling around town or what have you, you know, you realize you ignore about 90% of those signs, right? They become so prevalent in the environment that we tend to ignore them, right? And I like that aspect of that for these signs, because, you know, who am I to mess with everyday, these hardworking people here on the res, who am I to mess with their reality? So I put them up as road signs. People can choose to look at them or not. And I like that aspect of them. And so I have the Cahuilla at the top, and then I'm not sure if you can see it, but in smaller letters, I have the English. So I've, you know, typically it would be the English larger, right? And so this is Netach Muka, which it means I am singing. And I was trying to validate our contemporary tribal members' experience. I was trying to promote interest in our language reclamation. And I wanted my community to know that there's somebody making art for them. And actually, you know, I don't think anybody saw these as being art, which was fine. You know what they thought? They thought they were pretty cool. And that's enough for me. And so they lasted about 6 weeks, and then a cousin of mine got drunk and shot them up, which is almost, I call that reservation art criticism, but really what it is just they were finally embraced. This is what happens to a sign on the res. And so these signs have become, you know, they take on different forms or what have you. This sign, Muka, is the name of our creator. And so you can see how that works, you know, that the creator's spirit is everywhere. And then I've done recently, I installed a public art commission in Palm Springs, 13 signs in 6 different city parks throughout the city of Palm Springs. And some of you may know that Palm Springs, a lot of Palm Springs is the Agua Caliente Cahuilla Reservation. And so, again, I wanted to validate a contemporary native experience that, yes, this is our culture, it's important, and it's here visually, right? But also for the non-natives, I wanted to remind them, this is not the new world. Underneath all these tract home neighborhoods, underneath these golf courses and shopping centers, this is our history, right? This is an ancient land, and we are an ancient people. And as you can see from these signs too, I've abandoned the English altogether, and now I do imagery, and I do Cahuilla language. And so this is yucca, our word pana'u, the yucca plant. Here's a painting of the yucca plant. And the yucca plant, let me go forward one more. Two more, yeah. So the yucca plant there, this is a 10.5-foot tall sculpture, steel and aluminum, powder coated. And you know, the yucca plant, it was really important to us for food, for fiber, even for soap, okay? So it's important to our survival. I think a lot of people might see this sculpture and think, oh, that's nice. That's nice to look at, right? And they think it's just, it is what it is. For me, this is activist art. This is political art. I am making a political statement that yes, we are here, right? Our plants are here. Our traditional activities, right, are here. This is what we do. And so this is why I make these kinds of things. Now, if I go back real quick, here's that painting, Our Lady of San Jacinto. And so here you see, I've painted the pana'u, the yucca whiplei, and then I've created this halo of birdsong gourd rattles, right? And so I've already let the cat out of the bag, but there's my inspiration. Now, we didn't worship the plant. The plant was important to us. And so I was influenced by, inspired by this kind of altarpiece, kind of half arched canvas. And then you see the shape of the halo, and I saw that similar kind of shape in the blossoms. And then I have this halo of the rattles. So I'm not, you know, I'm influenced by all kinds of things within the culture, but also outside of the culture. I also want to say too that I think part of creative sovereignty too, and my responsibility goes beyond simply, you know, the things I make, but it's how I think and how I interact with the world. So a couple of years ago, UCR was working on its land acknowledgement statement, and I was part of this group that was working on that. And someone had mentioned, well, we should have, you know, caretakers of Mother Earth in there. Or what about Turtle Island, they were saying. And I was like, Turtle Island? I said, isn't that Anishinaabe? Isn't that like 1,700 miles from here, the Anishinaabe people? And, you know, when I was taught the creation story, you know, we don't have Mother Earth or Turtle Island. Mukit and Temayawet are our twin creators. We had Menil, the Moon Maiden, Isil, other demigods within our belief system. And so I'm very specific on what I choose to show, right? And what I choose to investigate. And you know, I'm very wary of sometimes things become this kind of pan belief system. And I don't want to participate in that. Part of creative sovereignty and that responsibility is understanding the specifics of being Cahuilla for me and for expressing that in my work. Now, you know, inevitably you begin to think about when you look at Native art and all the cultural appropriation that happens. And I think we can all agree, right, that when you see a millennial at the Coachella Music Festival in a Plains-inspired headdress, you're like, yeah, that's problematic, right? You know, but I have another way of thinking about it, and it's this. I am very wary of appropriating anything from my culture, okay? Cultural appropriation. Some aspects of Cahuilla culture are not for you, okay? They're specific to the Cahuilla people. And I can tell you, there are a couple of things in our creation beliefs that I think are visually just wow, they're so interesting. And culturally they're interesting, but visually I could see myself making and investigating these things, but they're not for you. And I resist, and I'm skeptical of my own motivation sometimes. You know, I'm my biggest critic, you know. I do think, right, and I do see that maybe sometimes artists themselves are guilty of appropriating from their own culture. Not everything needs to be seen in the gallery or the museum. And so I'm very conscious of that. So, you know, Cahuilla artistic tradition, the art form that's most known for the Cahuilla are the basketry tradition. And so here we have this 5-pointed flower here, the tobacco design. And then here it's harder to see, but there's, again, that number 5, right? So this is Donna Tortes and Nicolasa Potencio. And so these were historic baskets. And so I just want to point out, there's that 5-pointed star. Well, you know, a lot of times they say, oh no, all Native Americans had the 4-pointed morning star. It's like, well, no. So you have to resist that. And you have to deal with that. Some people will say 5 points. You don't know your history. I'm like, well, really? You know, this has happened to me before. And so this is where the Cahuilla 5-pointed star really comes from. So the plant, this is our tobacco plant. This is how we pray. And piva is our word for it. The Nicotiana attenui, I don't know if I'm saying that right, is the botanic word. But I want 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points there, and then 5 points on the Kixaval, which is the Jimson weed or Datura plant. These are 2 of our sacred plants. It's no accident the flowers, both of these plants open up at night, right? And so they're relatives. I don't know if they are botanically, but they're relatives spiritually, and they're important to our people. And so that's why it showed up in those baskets. And so when I make a basket sculpture, and I call these continuum baskets, I understand that history and that tradition. So this is from the Autry Museum. This is 5 feet, the diameter is 5 feet, and it's made entirely out of crushed beer and soda cans. So by doing these sculptures, I'm paying homage to our basket making tradition, but I'm also acknowledging the tradition of alcoholism and the tradition of diabetes that are wreaking havoc, right, in our communities. And that's that responsibility. That's like taking the culture in its totality, not just the good, pretty, fun stuff, all of it, right, and including that. And so in 2018, I was commissioned by the Palm Springs Art Museum to create a continuum basket for them at 8 feet. And so this was my original Sharpie, marker sketch for it. And so here we have, it's a combination of those 2 baskets I showed you. This is the 5-pointed tobacco flower, and then this is that bat design, the bats that fly around at night. And so that's why I have the blue here to symbolize the night sky. And this was the final product, again, 8 feet in diameter, and it ended up being over 1,800 cans, crushed aluminum, again, beer and soda cans. And what I've done, is, I feel like, is I've created something that's attractive. People seem to be drawn toward it. And then hopefully, you bring people in with something that's familiar, and then hopefully they think about what maybe the artwork is about. So here you see side by side, it actually turned out pretty good, and it's pretty close to the original. And so the blue cans are like Bud Light, I think. There's Diet Coke cans, there's Rolling Rock, there's Mountain Dew, there's Sprite. It's a whole palette of cans that I've used to create that. And so with that, it's good that we've been here together and we spent this time together. I hope I didn't overload you with too much information. And I think we're going to have some questions.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, thank you so much for that. It's really such a wide range of work and really powerful pieces that you shared with us. And as you know, I was interested in your concept of creative sovereignty, but I think that you did such a good job of defining it. And it's really powerful in that it seems like a lifelong process that people can engage in. And yeah, so some of the conversations that we've been having, we've been thinking about like the different ways that Indigenous people are theorizing and Indigenous scholars are theorizing sovereignty, embodied sovereignty, dancing sovereignty, visual sovereignty, performative sovereignty. And I think what these concepts do is like clarify the ways that bodies and movement forms and cultural productions are inherently political and lie at the heart of Indigenous people's struggles for self-determination. And I was really interested, one thing I hadn't seen yet was the Louisville Slugger baseball bat. And I was thinking, I would love to hear more about that And then also think through, ask you to think through a little bit the ways that you talked a little bit about physicality and the body and the labor. And so how that might be, sovereignty might be related to that through the making of your art, and then in particular, the war club.
Well, so one of the mistakes that people make are that artists like myself who work in a more contemporary form, that somehow, again, like the Cowboys and Indians, you have Crips and Bloods, right? You have the contemporary artists and the traditional artists, and it just doesn't, I've never come across that in any of my travels or talking with people. We all support one another. And, you know, I'm one of the biggest fans of traditional basketry. My daughter's doing some wonderful beadwork these days. And so it doesn't exist. And so when I go to museums, I love looking at everything, right? And so I've seen some amazing war clubs. I was in San Francisco and I saw an oceanic weapons kind of show in the Museum of Modern Art. It was just amazing. And so, but, you know, being on tribal council, I know we're constantly fighting to protect our sovereignty. And so the idea of making a war club that says sovereignty on it, I think it makes total sense. Now, that being said, here in Southern California, softball is really big within the Native communities. And a lot of times the tribes were playing in tournaments and things. And so I recognize that aspect of the baseball bat. But, you know, I specifically left that Louisville Slugger on there because I want people to know it is like it was something else, and now I've created something out of that. It's that idea of using the familiar to bring people in. And you know, ultimately my goal is, after people see my work and they get home and they're like, you know, what was that? What was that all about? And maybe it would spur some kind of conversation on that maybe people will consider things that they haven't considered before. And as far as the physicality goes, you know, I have a lot of anger and I have a lot of sorrow. That's part of that generational trauma, right? And so the physicality helps me. It helps me deal with those things. And it's not good to just sit around. I also play music. So it's, if I don't have time to get a bunch of stuff out in the studio, then I'll pick up a guitar or something. And, you know, and there's always something that needs to be done out in the farm. And so that physicality, I think, you know, like traditionally how we would have survived, right? Traditional ecological knowledge. We'd be tending plants, we'd be tending animals, we'd be tending, you know, everything around us. And so I think we just, you know, historically, this is who we are. We make with our hands, not to mention the fact that we were so poor, we didn't have much. So if we wanted to have a fort or a skateboard ramp or whatever, we had to build it ourselves. And so I you know, I got that pretty early on.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I'm also struck by people thinking about baseball as this sort of like all-American sport, but the ways that like indigenous sovereignty, you know, making that visible when it's so often, you know, eclipsed by settler colonialism. And then also the ways that like a lot of these contemporary practices really look like indigenous games as well.
Yeah, you know, a lot of people don't recognize that. The expectation, the category is so strong that they think it looks this way. You know, when Native people are playing in a softball tournament, that's not all that's going on. There are families getting together, right? There are relatives that are sitting behind the dugout. Someone's cooking, right? There's music going usually. It's the whole scene. And so I encourage my students when they go to a cultural event, don't just look, right? Don't just listen, smell and taste. It's a multi-sensory experience. That's what our culture is. And, you know, academia has kind of divided it into these pie slices, and we have a lot of experts in each slice. We don't have a lot of experts on the whole pie.
Great. I have other questions, but I just want to be aware of the time and also other people's questions as well. So a question about in this era of toppling monuments and renaming sports teams, is it also time to rename cities and streets in native languages across the board to create more cultural sovereignty for Indigenous people and recognition in the non-native community that we are on native land and that native people are still here?
I guess I would say I would support that. There is a town, maybe some of you have heard of it, that has an indigenous name. It's called Temecula, right? Or Wakpa. You know, there are actually a lot of towns that actually have the name Hemet. And so they're there. We just need to acknowledge them already. But I will say this, that I think that the toppling of the monuments and things, the changing of the Washington football team's name, I think those are all definitely steps in the right direction. But what I worry is that they are baby steps that are just going to stop and we go back to business as usual. You know, this has to be something, this is going to be a change that's going to take decades. It's not going to happen. And I also worry that people think the election in November is going to have this huge change. And I don't see that happening. Change happens over time. One of if there's any of my students on this, listening to this, they'll tell you, I always say, humanity is messy and it defies categorization, and things don't happen overnight. You know, that's the problem I have with the way history is taught, is sometimes we focus so much on dates that we think, oh, well, then the following year things were completely different. And it's not that way, you know. Things are very gradual. And I think the type of protest that I support the most right now with all the turmoil that's going on is that just quit shopping. You know, defund the corporations and defund the actual the administration. I think that's really the way that you could resist what is happening right now. But I should also say too, you know, a lot of people are talking about the anti-maskers, and America has done a really good job of selling the idea of freedom. Okay, but not a lot of people, these same people that are talking about freedom, not a lot of them are talking about responsibility. And this is where I think here, indigenous cultures, this kind of communal cultures, that we understand that it's not just about us. You know, that the American way goes back to the founders of the Western tradition, those Greeks. It's all about know thyself, right? The individual. And that is not our way. And so that's another kind of huge hurdle that I think, you know, this is why I think indigenous cultures and teachings are so important, because there's an answer to a lot of the ills that are happening in the world right now. And indigenous cultures know these answers. Nobody's asking them the question.
Yeah, no, I think that's so important too. And when you're talking about responsibility as well, like our responsibility to humans, but also responsibility to more than human relatives, as your work shows so clearly, right, with the yucca plant.
Absolutely.
So let's see, another question. Found objects ruminate throughout your work and interact in such beautiful ways with how capitalism operates. Could you speak to this a little more? How does your work with the found objects interact with the artwork you bring in from your ancestors? What is your approach to the archival work you also bring into play in your beautiful pieces? What miracles have you come across in the archive? A lot of great questions there from Mashana.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so I will say that I do like to take things that were thrown away, right? You know, we grew up poor, and I remember my dad, we would take a load to the dump of trash, and my brother and I would start going through stuff and seeing what we could find, and we'd bring it home and we would try to fix it and such. I mean, that's how it was, you know. And I think that aesthetic I kind of grew up with. But also, like I was saying, is when people are afraid of contemporary art because they don't get it, right? They haven't been trained to get it. And so by using the found object, I can kind of entice them into the work, at least where they'll approach it. And so that's part of the reason. But then also, you know, there's this indigenous concept that some of you may have heard of. It's called recycle, reuse, repurpose. Did you think the tree huggers came up with that in the 60s? Really? So we've always done that. And so, you know, like people think my work is so out there or what have you, but you know, a Cahuilla basket maker would leave their home, go out into the environment, and they would gather plant material. They would bring that home, they would treat it somehow, split it, soak it, what have you. Then they would combine it to make something useful and meaningful for the culture. Guess what? That's exactly what I do, except for maybe I go to a thrift store or I go through a junk pile somewhere, and I'm functioning. So my work, I see my work as like I titled those can baskets, a continuum of what we've done for thousands of years. I don't know if I fully answered that question. That was pretty complex.
Yeah, no, I think that was great, and it makes a lot of sense. Okay, a question here. Let's see here. Thank you, Gerald. My question is, how has the current political climate in the US impacted your art?
Well, one of the things that I didn't show is I've actually been thinking a lot about this whole immigration debate. And not a lot of people in America have even bothered to think about, well, maybe we should ask the Indians, right? And, you know, all my Indian contacts on social media, you know, we're all like bewildered, like, they're all immigrants, right? You know? And so I actually have a branding iron that says immigrant on it. And I have another one that says amnesia, because the American people have forgotten, you know. I look back at my own childhood and being in elementary school, and I was taught about the great melting pot. You remember that? And I was such an idiot because I believed it. I thought this was great, right? Oh, wonderful. And part of the reason why I started working at UCR was because there's such a diverse campus, and I just love it. And I love a lot of diversity in our classrooms. And so, you know, apparently America doesn't think that, or at least they haven't fully bought into it. I think like diversity in education or on campuses, I think most people would agree that diversity on college campuses helps students of color. Okay, I think that most people would give the thumbs up. What they don't fully acknowledge and fully want to accept is it's good for the white students too. It's good for everybody to have a diverse classroom. And you know, that's my idea. I mean, I bought into that version of a diverse, ethnically, religiously, gender identifying, all that. I bought into that as for America. And so that's the direction I want to see it go. And so by me doing, you know, artwork that's specific to my culture, what I'm trying to do is kind of add some breadth to this idea of it's not Native American art. There are, you know, hundreds of nations in this country, and Cahuilla is one of them.
So it looks like that might be all of the questions. I was thinking maybe just to give people, if anyone else wanted to add to those, but maybe I would ask you the final question that I sent you about your aim as an artist, and what do you want viewers to take away from the art that you make beyond, you know, what you've already shared?
Well, you know, like I said with the road signs, I want to validate the contemporary Cahuilla Indian experience and the Native American experience. You know, if you look at mainstream media, we are something of the past, and I don't buy that. I don't accept that. And so, you know, when I say I want people to, Indian people to see my work and to recognize that someone's doing something for them, I want them to understand that our culture is valuable. And like I said, we have answers for the world if anybody would bother to stop and listen. And so, you know, part of my, you know, I have to recognize that I take a lot of this with a grain of salt. You know, if you look at the mainstream art world, they'll say, oh, if everyone was an artist, the world would be great, blah, 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 you know. And they're like up on their high horse looking down on society. And I'm like, we need to go down into the trenches. I think academics need to get down into the trenches and be part of the community, not just above it looking down and criticizing. And we've had this form of academic education, Western form, for several hundreds of years. The art world as it exists today, a couple hundred years. And throughout that time, we've had war, we've had famine, we've had racism, we've had inequality. We need to get off our high horses and engage our local communities, right? And one of the things that I truly believe is the more personal I make my work, the more universal it becomes, because we're all human beings. We've all felt fear and happiness and depression and anger. And these are the things that, I hope to bring people together ultimately.
Yeah, no, I really hear your point and appreciate your point about scholars as well. I think this, the way that you're defining cultural sovereignty, it also seems like this is a process that would be good for community engaged research for scholars. Okay. Okay, so there's a question here. I'm going to read it. It says, being a half-blood, I've always been slammed from both sides and find myself raging at the ongoing injustice. How do you avoid or steer away from anger and negativity connected with our history?
I guess, as a mixed race person myself, I would say two things. I have that same anger, right? And sadness, right? And I harness it and I put it into the work, right? And then part of this idea of, a sovereign identity is there was a documentary about my return to the reservation back in 2003, 4, 5, somewhere around there. And a tribal elder, Ernest Siva, over there, who lives in Banning, California, he said, what makes a Cahuilla is someone who makes the decision to live as a Cahuilla. So that doesn't come from outside, that comes from within your own person. And so my dad passed away in 2003. I was up for tenure at a university in Oklahoma at the time. But I knew I had to take over the ranch. So I quit my job and I moved here. And, I wasn't going to, I guess I wasn't going to allow anything else like a job or promotion or anything like that to define who I am. I knew who I was and I knew what I had to do. And that came from within. That was a decision that was within my heart. And I think that's key is this idea of the take ownership of your own sovereignty. And, I made the decision, I'm going to live as a Cahuilla person. So I gather food out in the environment. I still hunt and I have a garden and all those things. I sing songs, right? I research, and all those things are part of my sovereign identity.
Thank you. There is another question here about a couple more questions coming in. I just wanted to say, people are asking when the recording of this session will be available, and I think that would be a question for Pamela. But this next question says, if I remember correctly, the Palm Springs Art Museum featured Gerald, your art, and many others, but also Edward Curtis. How do you feel about Edward Curtis still being upheld as a key figure in Indigenous art?
My response to that would be he's not within Native circles. We all know, the joke that he would take a Maidu person and dress him up as, a Paiute and take their picture, that you have to take it all with a grain of salt, right? And that he was, like James Earl Fraser, he was documenting, right, this vanishing race. Well, guess what? We're still here. And there are actually a number of contemporary Native American artists who are riffing off of Curtis. I will say, though, that show at the Palm Springs Art Museum, that's the other thing. Who is when you see an exhibit or what have you, a book, a show catalog, who is it written for? Who is the audience? And when you look at Edward Curtis's work, that audience, it's for a non-Native audience. And so I would contest that you know, he doesn't really represent anything, but I know a lot of Native photographers who are riffing off of him and actually bringing an element of reality or truth to it. Now, that being said, I do want to point out too that my show at the Palm Springs Art Museum got cut off short because of COVID, and they've offered to extend it. So when the museum opens back up, possibly in October, my show will continue to be up from October to the end of November.
Thank you. So it looks like there's one final series of questions unless other questions roll in, and we were told we have until about 4:30. So if you do have additional questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat. So this is a series of questions asking, can you share some of the logistics of the process when you worked with the city of Palm Springs to make signs in Cahuilla? Was it a call for proposals? Did you come up with the idea and ask them to fund it? I'm asking this question because you inspire people to ask us natives for solutions. What does this process look like? What are the logistics and the on-the-ground work for Indigenous people to share the answers we have?
Well, so I will say that process, you know, I've been doing this art thing now for close to 30 years. And for the first 25 years of it, you know, I've done a lot of things on my own dime. And, you know, I would load up my pickup truck and drive 6 hours, install a show. I had no money to stay the night, so I would just drive home. And so I've done a lot of things, you know, and I've tried to you know, enter any kind of competitions or proposals and all that. And, you know, you have to have a tough skin to be an artist because you get way more rejections than you do acceptances. But finally, after 30 years, people are starting to come to me and ask me for my work, which is, it's kind of nice, finally, you know. And keep in mind, part of the reason for that is because I wasn't doing the expected. And, you know, like, I'm very skeptical of my own motivations. I'm like I said, I'm my biggest critic, and I don't like to be too comfortable. And so if I get you know, when you have an art show and everyone compliments you and tells you how great you are and they love this work, and before you know it, you start plagiarizing yourself, right? That sounds strange to say, but you start doing your greatest hits and you get addicted to that attention. And I just refuse to do that. So if I get too comfortable doing one thing, I just switch. And that has made it hard for curators and gallery owners because they want something predictable, right? Because the commodification of the art in the art world, it's easier to sell that stuff, right? So actually the Arts Commission asked me to submit a proposal, and I had been doing these signs for over a decade at that time. And, you know, these things, working with civic organizations, they tend to not move very fast. And my show at the Palm Springs Art Museum, we spent 2 years negotiating and figuring out what that was going to look like before we actually opened the doors to the museums, to the show. And so, you know, you have to have a lot of patience, you have to have a tough skin. And, you know, one of the big negotiations with the Palm Springs Art Museum was actually what was the reception going to look like when we did open the show. And their practice at the time was to have an opening reception with food and wine, right? You guys stick out your pinky and that kind of thing for their members and for their donors. And I'm like, wait a minute, what about the Indian people? What about the public that you serve? So we had this kind of, you know, dialogue back and forth, and we ended up just opening it up. And there were over 400 people at the opening reception. Willie Pink from down northern San Diego, he cooked all indigenous foods for us. So we had, I think we had We Wish there, which is our acorn dish. We had mesquite, we had, you know, yucca. We had it all there at the opening. And we had bird singing as well and dancing. And I think, you know, institutions are afraid. They're very tentative to do anything new or different. But I think in the end, it was hugely successful, and they had more natives there. You know, a lot of natives who live in the area had never really been to that museum, and all of a sudden they're there. So the the museum benefited from doing something new and changing their old ways. And I think natives and non-natives alike want something new, and they want real authenticity, right? They don't want the showy stuff. They want the real deal. They want the real story. And so, you know, it's, you shouldn't have to spend your career educating non-natives about what you do, right? These professionals in the museum field or in academia, they need to do their due diligence to come to an understanding of where I'm coming from. That's not what happens though. And you end up falling into this didactic role of having to teach everybody about your culture and about your practice as an artist, etc. It's not fair, but that's the reality.
Yeah, and I think there's one more question, which is a related question, I think, about your advice for starting artists, especially as a starting Indigenous artist.
I would say this: do not make art, okay? Because if you're making art, you're actually making someone else's idea of what an art object is. Don't even think about art, right? Stay away from the art magazines too, right? What I suggest you do is, you ready for this? You need to do what you do and present it to the world and say, this is my art. You see that difference there? Because then you are doing, this is part of that creative sovereignty. You're not making someone else's idea of what art is, right? Or music or theater or any of those things. Do what you do. Do what you're passionate about and put it out in the world and say, this is my art. That's really what the art world needs.
Yeah, that's really inspiring. Thank you. Does anyone else, it looks like I don't see any additional questions, but if you have anything else you'd like to ask.
I would say, if you don't make art and you do what you do, you're going to have to be ready for a long, hard road. And that's been my road. It's certainly not, you know, my first big retrospective there at the Palm Springs Art Museum that's up right now, that didn't come easy. And you just have to be diligent. And if you're passionate and you care about what you do and you feel that responsibility, right? That's what fuels your fire and keeps you going. Ooh, I'm getting emotional all of a sudden. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I had a Native professor at Berkeley I really respect. And one thing she said about teaching Native studies, she said, if you're teaching it correctly, it should be fundamentally challenging. And that always gave me like a lot of courage. And I found that very inspiring as well.
Well, so when I was teaching art, I encourage my students to fail, actually, because if you never fail, then you're not trying hard enough. You're not going out. You're not going out on the limb far enough, and you're not digging deep enough to do something that is real, I think. And so I fail all the time. I wish maybe if I was more talented, but when I go into the studio, it's a struggle. It's a constant struggle, and I make a lot of bad art too. That's part of the process. If you're afraid to fail, if you're afraid to make bad art, you're never going to do anything meaningful, in my opinion.
There's a question about the United States of Amnesia too. Was misspelling Sweden intentional? As a Swede, I thought it was hilarious and perfectly appropriate and deserved.
No, it wasn't intentional. In fact, I didn't even notice that. But I will tell you that, like when I did that self-portrait, or United States of Amnesia too is another one of the word stamped artworks. But I will tell you that those artworks, they're very difficult to do, like where you do a little bit, then you go take a break, or you come back tomorrow and you work a little bit more. I don't ever do them that way. I do them all in one setting. And so like that self-portrait was probably 6 straight hours. And the United States of Amnesia was probably like 12 or 14 hours straight. And so you know, I probably, that may have been one of the later ones I did, and I was just like kind of out of it at the time. But that's, you talk about process. So, you know, when I go into the studio, like in the morning, the first thing I do is I clean my studio. And I put all the tools away and any objects I'm using and sweep, and everything's nice and clean. And then I start in, because the whole time I'm putting things away, I'm physically warming up, kind of, right? And then I go to work, and then I work till I'm just exhausted. And, you know, I'm convinced I'm a hack, and this is horrible what I did today. I don't know what I was thinking. And I just say the heck with it, and I just leave everything as out and laying around the studio, and I come inside the house and I go to bed. And then the next morning I come in, I clean the studio, and then I start back in, and well, maybe this has got some direction. And you know, it's a tug of war. It's a constant struggle. And so when I hear people say, oh, I love to make art, it's so relaxing, I have no idea what they're talking about.
Yeah, I feel that in the writing process as well. After a long day of writing.
It's the creative process, right? Yeah,
yes, exactly. Yeah, and then we have a question about you know, your work is deep and meaningful. How are you defining meaningful, or how are you thinking about creating meaningful work?
Well, I never make things that are just they are what they are. There's like layers, right? And some people are only capable of going so deep. But I always, you know, I always try to have some kind of meaning or content in there. And it's not always positive. It's not always fun, beautiful, or joyful. But you know, humanity, there's the whole spectrum of humanity. And some people are going to look at it a certain way, and other people are going to look at it a different way. And actually, remember the Gordon Johnson quote where he says, well, I can't speak for everyone, but I'm kind of that way too in my art. You know, I've heard people look at my artwork and they come up with an interpretation that I actually didn't mean in my artwork. And so I start looking at the artwork and I go, oh, yeah, I can see that, you know? And it's kind of funny because even though I'm the maker, doesn't mean I understand totality, how it's going to be accepted. And so I actually learn new things from my own artwork and from hearing other people interact with it. And I you know, a lifelong learning, if that's not an indigenous characteristic, I don't know what is, right? And so I love hearing other people look at my work and interpret it. And it's not a right or wrong answer. Again, this is not quantifying anything, right? It's everyone's bringing their own personal experiences to it. And I love the diversity, and I love the spectrum of opinions when people look at my work.
Thank you. Someone is asking about the Falling Rock. Yeah, a couple of questions. Tell us the story of Falling Rock, the Falling Rock publication. What is it about, and when will it be released?
Okay, so there's a big 150-page catalog that's connected to my show there at the Palm Springs Art Museum, and everything got derailed by the pandemic. And so when the museum reopens in October, at some point it will be available for purchase there at the museum. And I'm real proud of it. And Gordon Johnson has some writing in there. Ashley Holland has some writing in there. And you know, I'm real proud of that. But the story Falling Rock, and I've named my website that, and we named the exhibit that, was, you know, my parents, you know, everything that could go wrong with the interracial marriage, that was my parents. You know, they just really, they had love for one another, but they just couldn't really see eye to eye. And they divorced when I was like three and a half. And my dad would pick me up every weekend and in the summers, and he'd bring me back to the reservation. And we'd come up here to the mountains where my reservation is, and I would see those road signs, and it would say, beware of Falling Rock. And as a, you know, 7, 8-year-old kid, I was like, what is Falling Rock, you know? And so I asked my dad, and he said, that's the name of the last wild Indian who never gave in to the white man. And everywhere he was spotted attacking passing cars, they would put a sign up. And so driving around when I was a kid, you know, I'd be looking out the window looking for falling rock because I was ready to join up, boy, you know. And so it's that spirit. It's that spirit of never giving up. That's kind of my motto, right? Yeah. Oh, by the way, years and years later, I told my dad, I said, you know, remember that story of Falling Rock? He had no memory of it at all. And so isn't that funny that, you know, all of us who have kids, you tell your kids stuff and then, you know, we don't think anything about it. And then the kid just like takes off with it. It's become, you know, like part of my belief system, you know.
Wow, that's beautiful. Someone is very impressed with all of your commitments with serving on your tribal government, as I think we all are, raising cattle, pigs, chickens, daughters, teaching, making art, lecturing, indigenizing UCR, and everything else. How many hours a night does Gerald Clarke sleep?
I'm no good to anybody without 8 hours. I gotta have 8 hours, you know. But I will say, as I get older, I seem to need less sleep, you know. So that's been good. Because I remember when I was a college student, I could sleep till noon, no problem, you know. But not these days. I'm up about between 6 and 7. But you know, I will say, you know, some of that sadness, depression that I've felt on and off in my life, it helps me to stay busy. So the ranch life, the gardening, the tribal council stuff, the art, it helps me. It's therapeutic, I think, to keep busy.
Okay, and Pamela is a lot of comments. I don't know if these will be on the video, but a lot of comments, just people saying that the talk really fed their soul and made them tear up. So I want to make sure that you're aware of those, Gerald.
Well, you know, in my classes too, I always try to bring humanity to the subject, right? And I remind people, these aren't simply facts and dates and things like that. This is, you know, people, real human beings. And you know, where I got that was, I used to take art history students to the Dallas Museum of Art when I taught in Oklahoma, and everyone was ready to go and see the ancient Egyptian art and, you know, show me the mummy. They were all, you know, and I'm like, wait a minute, that's a human being. That's someone who lived, who loved, who felt jealousy, who felt joy, who felt sadness. And this idea of the mummy is turned a human being into an artifact. That's why NAGPRA issues are so important, right? And how did we get there? It's because we've sucked the humanity out of the humanities in so many ways. And so critical thinking and remembering that the human experience, like there's no such thing in my mind as an illegal alien. What they are fathers and daughters and uncles and cousins, right? They're real people, and to categorize them as simply illegal aliens allows, you know, the authorities, right, to discriminate and to violate their rights because they've been dehumanized. And I think that's a human tragedy that's happening right before our eyes right now.
Okay, and thank you so much for everything that you've shared. And I think that we're gonna have to end at this point. I don't know if there's anything else you would like to say, but thank you so much for sharing your words and your art. And I've learned a lot and really enjoyed it as well.
Well, it's a blessing for me too. And I appreciate everyone who participated, again, all the organizers, and you know, it's a humbling experience for me. So I thank you.
Yes, and before Pamela would like to conclude before the end here.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for participating in our talk today. Thank you very much, Gerald and Tria, for hosting. The video should be available hopefully within a week. Follow us on social media at UCLA AISC on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and you can hear more of our upcoming events. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.